So now we come to the next step. Resist the dangerous message of bondage. It involves the requirement of circumcision, 5:2 through 6. Its perpetrators will be judged, 5:7 through 12. So some people start the exhortation section here. So, I started it at 4:12 with the first imperative. But for the first time in the letter, Paul tells us, we know because we've read this letter, but now this is the first time we know that circumcision is the issue. Right? He brings it up in 2:3 through 5, but that's what happened in Jerusalem, remember? That was an issue with Titus in Jerusalem. Now, for the first time, Paul tackles the issue in Galatia, which is very instructive to us, right? He doesn't, the presenting issue is circumcision, but Paul is given a whole theology before he gets to the issue at hand. So I think that's very instructive to us pastorally. Paul doesn't just say, he could have just said, dear Galatians, the false teachers are saying you ought to be circumcised. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't give in to circumcision. Remember the gospel, love Paul. Right? But instead, he gives them the whole theology, so by the time he gets to this exhortation, they understand it in light of his whole theology, why this is a bad idea. So he doesn't just go to don't, right? And it relates again to the kind of things we're talking about. Rules and laws without the gospel mean very little, right? It can just be a kind of legalism. So Paul says, take note, or literally, behold, I, Paul. So this is very solemn, right? They know it's Paul, but he's saying, look, it's I, it's Paul. This is a solemn, serious moment. Now it's the point of decision. I'm telling you that if you get yourselves circumcised, Christ will not benefit you at all. Christ will not profit you at all. So what is he saying? If you are circumcised, you are damned. If Christ will not benefit you at all, you're not saved. So here's a warning, right? He's warning them, and he's saying, if you give in to a false gospel, Christ is of no benefit to you. You're not saved. You're not a believer. Now be careful. He's not saying he's not declaring you're not a believer. He's warning them. He's warning them. A warning isn't the same as a declaration. Right? If I say, if you drink this, which this is obviously not true, if you drink this, you will die because it's poison, I'm not saying you're dead, right? I'm saying don't drink it. Jesus said, if you deny me, I'll deny you. That's a warning, isn't it? If you deny Jesus fully and finally, he'll deny you on the final day. You'll go to hell, right? He warns us. That's what Paul's doing here. If you submit to circumcision, so I take it they have not yet, right? They're thinking about it. But if you give in, he says, now we have to say this, right? If you give in the circumcision for salvation, right? By the way, I did my dissertation on circumcision. That was the topic I studied. My mom, who maybe she repented at the end, she's no longer alive, but my mom wasn't a believer. My mom was totally perplexed by this. She asked me if I was going to go to hospitals and watch people get circumcised. And I said to her, Mom, it has nothing to do with that. I said, Mom, do you think I'm a weirdo? I said, I don't care about watching people get circumcised. I said, this is a theological topic I'm looking at. So why did I say that? It's not about being circumcised for medical reasons. If a person's circumcised for medical reasons, most doctors, it's debated, most doctors, I don't know what you do in Ethiopia, but most doctors in the United States still say it's not a big deal. There's some moderate benefit of circumcision in terms of cervical cancer in women, some cancers in men. So most people in the United States still practice circumcision, but it's not, I don't know what you say, you're a doctor. But yeah, it's debated, and I'm no doctor. Do you have an opinion? seriously though, so for medical reasons it's one thing, but for salvation, you know, so Paul has no issue for circumcision if it's for cultural reasons, medical reasons, but if you're circumcising to get saved, then there's no hope. Then Paul says, again I testify to every man who gets himself circumcised that he is obligated to do the entire law. So the language of testify is very strong, right? It's court language. So it's very solemn, it's very serious. And he says again, and I think he's thinking of Galatians 3:10. Remember we looked at that verse yesterday? All who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, because it is written, everyone who does not do everything written in the book of the law is cursed. So you have to keep the whole law. You have to keep the whole law perfectly. And I think he says here, again, I testify to every man who gets himself circumcised. You're obligated, you're obliged, you've got to keep the whole law to be saved. So he's saying, you want to get circumcised? So, which I think shows, you know, the issue is not only circumcision over against a new perspective. You must keep the whole law. Now, if you submit to circumcision, you must keep the whole law to be saved. What if the Galatians were to say, okay, that's what we'll do. We will keep the whole law, but what does Paul say? You can't do that. It's impossible. You can't keep the whole law. Everybody sins. So those who are trying to be justified by the law are alienated from Christ. They have fallen from grace. If someone does this, if someone falls in such a way, they have, you know this word, right? They have apostatized. They have fallen away. So that's the very strong warning. What's the warning? If you when Paul comes down to it, if you receive circumcision, if you try to be justified by the law, by the way, here's good evidence, right? The issue is not just circumcision, is it? It's not just the boundary markers. It's trying to be justified by the law in general, isn't it? Once you're opening the door to keep the whole law. Once you've done that, you've fallen from grace. You've denied the gospel. By way of contrast, Paul says, for we believers eagerly await apekdecametha. You see that word? Apekdecametha? That word is always used in Paul of end-time eschatological realities. So, and of course, that fits with how it's translated. We eagerly await. We eagerly await something that we will receive on the last day. He's not saying we eagerly await it and we'll get it tomorrow. No, we'll get it on the day of the resurrection. We eagerly await by the Spirit. So the Spirit begins to dominate chapters 5 and 6 especially. We live not by the flesh, but by the Spirit. So we eagerly await by the Spirit and by faith, not by works, right? Clearly, the above is by works. You're trying to be justified by the law. You're wanting to do the whole law. The other is based on doing. But we are not, Paul says, relying on the flesh, but the Spirit. We are not focused on doing, but on believing, on faith. Once again, I think we see this noun faith clearly refers to we, by faith, our faith, not the faithfulness of Christ. There are interpreters who think this is the faithfulness of Christ. I think that's a very strained and very improbable reading. So we are waiting for the hope of righteousness. So we're righteous now by faith, but we're waiting for that eschatological day when God proclaims to the whole world, these are the righteous ones. You know, you can walk the streets of Addis Ababa, right? And people, if you don't know the people, you don't know which people are true Christians, right? Unless you already know them. But you don't know. But on the last day, God will proclaim publicly, these are the ones who are in the right. These are the ones who belong to God. People, when we go to the airport today, people will not say, there go Tom and Diane. They are God's children. They won't know us from anybody else, right? So, but that day is coming when this public proclamation will take place. So we look forward to the we already are righteous by faith, right? There's an already, not yet. We're righteous by faith now, but it hasn't been proclaimed to the world yet. It is hidden from the world, and sometimes it's even hidden from us, isn't it? Sometimes we doubt that verdict in our own lives. But on the last day, we will no longer doubt it, because that public proclamation will be made. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision accomplishes anything. That fits with what I just said. Paul doesn't care at the end of the day whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised. Paul doesn't want anyone to be proud of being uncircumcised either. You know, one bad response to the letter would be, well, hey, I don't have any problem with this. I'm not uncircumcised. And Paul says, don't be proud of that either. Don't be proud of anything. Paul says, in and of itself, I don't care about circumcision. I don't care about uncircumcision. What matters is faith working through love. I think I like, is it the NIV translation better? I think it's clear. Yeah, I think the NIV is very nice here. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Faith is the root, love is the fruit, right? Faith is the root, love is the fruit. Faith is the root of all virtues, isn't it? So I think that's what Paul's saying. What matters is, are you trusting God? Clearly, faith, again, is our faith, isn't it? It's our faith that expresses itself. It shows up in love. If we're loving others, that love, true love, comes from trusting God, from relying upon Him, from hoping in Him. So faith is always the issue. So I'm going to split you up in groups in a minute again, because there's an interesting thing to discuss. But let's do 5, 7 through 12 quickly. So now he talks about its perpetrators will be judged. You were running a good race. So the Christian life is often pictured as a marathon, isn't it? It's the running of a race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? So, you know, you have a race, and you can have a race, especially short races. People may cut in on one another and cause someone to trip. Many years ago in the United States, we had a very famous runner named Mary Decker. She was running the Olympics, and somebody, I mean, who knows what happened, cut in her, she tripped and fell, and that was it, you know. She's crying, and all, you know, you imagine all that training, all that work, day after day, and it was all over in seconds. Someone cut in on her, or maybe it was her own fault. I mean, I don't have any opinion on that. But, you know, that's the illustration. You're running the race, and he's saying, who did that? Well, you know, it's the false teachers. He says, you guys were running along fine, and then these people came in, and they caused problems. This is a common problem, isn't it, in Christian history? I talked to some missionaries, I forget where they were located, but they said, you know, we do our ministry, and then the Jehovah's Witnesses come in after us, and they cause all kinds of problems, and they confuse the people. And so here are these false teachers, they're running the race, and they cut in, and they're trying to keep you from obeying the truth of the gospel, right? They're trying to subvert you. We all ought to be alert. So first for your own life, but then, you know, for your flock. Part of Part of your job, some people who study theology, they get so entranced with theology, they just love the intellectual life of it, and it's so fascinating, but they're not shepherds, right? And you're to be shepherds, right? And you're to think of how can I promote the faith of others? How can I build them up? I think of John Fulmer in Dubai. I mean, John's a shepherd, right, of that flock. He cares for that flock, and he's always thinking of how it can be strong in the Lord, and that's what you want to do as well as shepherds. Paul tells them that kind of persuasion is not from the one who called you. Remember, what does calling mean? Someone tell me. We talked about that. What's the word call mean in Paul? It's an effective call, right? It's the effectual call. It's the call that creates faith. Brian said that, right? It's the call that creates faith. So this persuasion is not from the one who called you. So this happens, right? People come in and try to persuade us of things that are not in accord with the gospel. I'm just saying this because you're studying, right? You guys have a particular responsibility to guard your flock from those who do this. And of course, Paul is doing this. A little yeast or a little leaven leavens the whole lump. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. So I think it's clear what Paul's saying there. We've already seen it. Get rid of the slave woman and her son. Drive it out. Don't let false teaching get a foothold in your church, because it'll permeate it, right? You let a little bit in of false teaching, and it'll have terrible consequences. He's saying. So he's done. There's a kind of tolerance that's dangerous, right? Now, we're not talking about people disagreeing on the Sabbath. We're not talking about people disagreeing on the millennium or the rapture. That's not false teaching, right? We're not even, I think, talking about people disagreeing on baptism. Presbyterians and Baptists disagree. We don't say Presbyterians are heretical. We're talking about the center of the gospel, right? False teaching, denial of the Trinity, clearly. Denial of the deity of Christ. Denial of justification by faith. Denial of the inerrancy of the scriptures, right? There's a book by James Butchell. It's called The Dying of the Light, and it's all about these American universities. Many universities in America were established as Christian universities. And and it's the story of how all these universities ended up becoming secular. Every one of them, it began, how did the seminaries start to fall? They began to say there's errors in the Bible. Every one of them. And look at where they are today. The first people who said there's errors in the Bible, they would be shocked at where Harvard is today. Shocked. Because they were still somewhat conservative, They'd say there's errors in the Bible, but we still believe in the gospel. I believe there are people who think there are errors in the Bible who are Christians, right? Some of my teachers. But the problem is they're children, and they're children's children, because they set something going that never stops there. So my doctoral supervisor, he was a believer. He believed there's errors in the Bible. He taught at Fuller Seminary. You know what he said to me lately? I can't believe how postmodern Fuller is becoming, because Fuller has now moved far away from where he was. And no surprise, right? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. You let that teaching in. He didn't recognize it in his own life. I love him, but that is super dangerous. So false teaching has a tremendously bad effect. He says, I'm confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. That's a very important verse. Paul says, I believe you're going to do the right thing. I believe you're going to follow what I'm saying here. I'm persuaded about you that you're not going to follow these false teachers. I believe you're going to listen to what I say in this letter. You're going to believe what I say about myself as an apostle. You're going to be reminded of the gospel. I've seen signs you're really saved. So I'm very confident about you. I believe you're going to heed the warning I gave to you. When I tell you that's poison, you're going to say, I don't want to drink that. I don't want to go that way. So he says, but he goes on to say, but the one who is disturbing you, there's the word tarason. Remember where we saw that earlier? We go so fast in here, right? But he says, there are some who are tarasantas. There are some who are disturbing you, throwing you into confusion, right? There's some who are disturbing you. And he comes back to them. These are the false teachers. There are some who are disturbing you or throwing you into confusion. And whoever that may be, I don't think Paul means by that, I don't know who it is. Whoever may that be, I don't know. I think he's using the singular as a generic. Whoever holds that view, that person will be judged, I think is what he's saying. They'll bear his judgment. So there's that word bastadze, the future active indicative third singular, right? We'll see that word again. That's why I'm showing you that, from bastadzo. They're going to bear their judgment. So you hang on. Recognize these false teachers will be judged. Brothers and sisters, if I'm still preaching circumcision for salvation, why am I still being persecuted? In other words, the opponents must have said, Paul preaches circumcision too. They must have said that. And they must have said, actually, you know, when Paul's other places, he says you ought to get circumcised. And Paul says, if that's true, why am I being persecuted? That's crazy. I don't do that. How dare they say that? Because in that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. Because the offense of the cross, what's the offense of the cross? The offense of the cross is, you're not good. You're evil. You're wicked. That takes the Holy Spirit, because I know, I take it you know, in and of myself, apart from the grace of God, I am an idolater. I'm wicked. I'm destructive. So when I read, you read in the headlines the things happening, horrible things people do. I could do all those things apart from the grace of God, and so could you, right? The worst things that are done. So preaching the law and preaching circumcision removes the offense of the cross, because preaching the law says what you basically need is to be morally improved. You're a good person. Just be good. Be good. Work it out. Try harder. But the cross says, no, there's no hope for you. You need to die and be raised from the dead. You need the gospel. Then Paul says something very surprising. As for these agitators, these who disturb you. By the way, that word anastatuntes, I'm doing this by memory, so let's see if I get it. But, yeah. But when they did not find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, these men who have caused trouble all over the world, these men who are anastatosantas, right? These men that are upsetting the whole world have come here, Paul and Silas. So there's the word. These people have turned the world upside down. Well, now Paul's saying that, obviously in a different sense, about these false teachers. These people are causing problems. And he says, I wish they would emasculate themselves. So Luther translated this in his very vivid way. I wish they'd let the knife slip, So he says, Paul says, that's quite shocking, right? Paul says, I just wish they'd cut off the sex organ, right? Whoa, that is super strong. I didn't write that, I'm not. That's what Paul wrote. He does something very similar in Philippians 3, who had the same problem. Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of the mutilation, katatomen, for we are the true circumcision, peritome. Do you see Kata, and then you have the word tome, which means cut, temno, to cut down. Peritome, peri in Greek, to cut around. Circumcision, to cut around. Katatome, to cut down. There he says, what they call circumcision is actually pagan mutilation. So, you know, Paul grew up as a good Jewish boy. And you know, during the Maccabean revolt, you know about the Maccabean revolt? During that Maccabean revolt, Jewish children who were circumcised were taken from their mothers and thrown down on the pavement and killed in horrific acts of violence by Antiochus Epiphanes' soldiers. Paul can say, which was a very evil thing, by the way, that they did. But Paul can say, almost 200 years later, if you're circumcised for salvation, it's like saying to God, hey, God, will you please accept me into your presence? Please accept me, and I'll show you how much I love you by cutting off my sex organ. Right? And Paul says, that's pagan. What they call circumcision is pagan. By the way, you know, I talked about kata temno. So with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, remember what they did, part of what they did is they cut themselves to get Baal to answer, remember? And there's the verb kata, it's the verb, remember, kata tome, but here's the verb kata temno. They cut themselves with a sword or with knives, right? Baal, answer us. We'll get Baal to answer us. We'll cut ourselves, you know? And Elijah mocks them and says things like, yeah, maybe he's sleeping, you know? Maybe he's in the bathroom. So we have this paganism. So Paul can say very strong things about this. He says this to shock them, doesn't he? To shock them out of doing something wrong. Okay, so now what I want you to do is Paul warns them, if you receive circumcision, if you go this right, you're going to go to hell. He's warning Christians of this. So I want you to get in your group and say, how do we do that? I mean, what does that mean that we warn people? Can we warn people that if you do this, I mean, I thought they're truly saved. Why does Paul warn them, if you do this, you'll be damned? How can he do something like that? Do you see what I'm saying? So should we do that today? And say to true Christians, if you abandon the gospel, you'll be damned. And how do we do it today? Hey guys, anything you want to share? Yeah, I like that a lot because we're to take the warnings seriously, right? The warnings are there for our benefit. We don't just say, it doesn't matter. I think the parallel, Jesus says, if you deny me, I will deny you. God uses that in our hearts so that we say, I don't want to deny Jesus. Give me the strength to stay true. Help me not to fall away. Yeah, exactly. I think that's super helpful too. The warnings, I totally agree with that. The warnings don't dampen our assurance. They actually, when we respond to them, they build our assurance. They're part of our assurance. They don't cause us to question our salvation. They give us more assurance when we respond to them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, it's not the only note we strike or necessarily what we're saying all the time. Yeah, that's great. Let's look at this section. Live out freedom in the Spirit. So this is the rest of the letter till the conclusion, the summary. Freedom expressed in love, living by the Spirit instead of the flesh, caring for one another by the Spirit, and doing good by the Spirit. So here we go. This is a very important section. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. There's the word calling again. You were effectually called, right? And you were called to freedom. Freedom from the law, brothers and sisters. But, and Emmanuel already said this, right? But here it is in the text. But do not use your freedom as to indulge or as an opportunity. That word can be used as a bridgehead of operations, like for a military battle. You know, you set up your camp and plant your strategy. Don't use freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. There, the flesh stands for the old Adam in us, right? The old unregenerate person. Sometimes the word flesh just means body, right? But here it stands for the sin principle in us. Our freedom should never be an excuse for license, for giving into sin in certain ways. I know, again, when I was at Fuller Seminary, some of those students who had come from a very legalistic background, but they were experiencing their freedom in Christ, but they went too far, some of them. Here's an example. There was a birthday party. I was not at this birthday party. For a man, and his wife hired a male stripper. She hired a male stripper for the party. Well, I remember having a discussion with students, and the students were saying, "Is this sin?" And I said, "Obviously it's sin." You know, what do you mean? What do you mean is this sin? It's sin to hire a female stripper. It's sin to hire a male stripper. So what was happening? They were using their freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Paul says, "Be careful. You are free, but what does he say next? Rather serve one another, or be slaves to one another, right? Doulouta. Be slaves to one another through love." Freedom, there's a paradox here. Freedom expresses itself in being enslaved, so to speak. It's paradoxical, right? To doing what's right, to being loving. Calvin said something, I'm just paraphrasing him. Perfect freedom is being enslaved to God. Perfect freedom is being enslaved to what is good. Of course, the word slavery could be misunderstood, but we're perfectly free when we're doing what's right. That's what true freedom is. We all know that, right? We've all experienced that. We're happiest as Christians when we're doing what's right. We sense that's what I was made for. I was made to do what is good. When we're doing what is evil, that's not what we were made for, and it's a sign that we're a Christian, right? It's a sign that you're a believer. When we're doing evil, we hate it, and we repent of it. But when we're doing good, we sense that this is the right thing. And freedom expresses itself especially through love for one another, through serving one another. I just have to say, there's so many examples of this in my life, but the greatest example for me is my wife. She is a very loving person, and I've seen her serve so many people over the years through love. We've had many, many people over the years over to our house, staying overnight, staying with us for 2 weeks, serving them meals, and it wouldn't happen without her, right? I'm off working, studying, doing my thing, but she's cooking, caring for them, changing the laundry, There's different ways to serve one another, but it's very practical, isn't it? To serve one another through love. That's perfect freedom. And then he says, the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Some people have said, wait a minute. In 5:12, Paul said, or not 5:12, 5:3, Paul says, in context, you're not obligated to do the whole law. Now he says, the whole law is fulfilled. Where is that? Right here. In keeping this one command. But I think it's very important that he uses plerao, and here, which is fulfill, right? And here he uses the word poiao, to do. It's not, Paul doesn't use the language of doing the law, but fulfilling the law. The entire law is fulfilled in this command. Love your neighbor as yourself. You all know that comes, but let's read it. That comes from Leviticus 19:18. Don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. That's where he's getting that from. We know Jesus, Matthew 22, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So what Paul says here, he doesn't focus on the first answer because he's thinking more horizontally of our love for one another. But he focuses on our love to one another. And he says, when we love our neighbors as ourselves, then we fulfill the law. I don't hear this as often. Some people have used this command to say you really need to love yourself. But I agree with those who say Paul's assuming you love yourself. He's not commanding you to love yourself. He's saying we all care about ourselves. Love others as you love yourself. Now I want to think about how. I thought Paul said we're not under the law, and now he says the whole law is fulfilled. So how do we put that together? So it's put together in different ways, right? Covenant theologians tend to say we are not under the ceremonial law and the civil law. Civil law is the law for government, but we're under the moral law. That's one way of putting it together. Lutherans, and I'm closer to Luther on this point, Lutherans and progressive covenantalists, I call myself a progressive covenantalist. You all had Peter Gentry recently. Did he talk about progressive covenantalism at all? Not that much. But he and Steve Wallum have written a book together, Kingdom Through Covenant. There's a big version, and then there's a smaller version. The smaller version is a good introduction. I forget what they call the smaller version, but you can see that progressive covenantalism argues, and I agree with this, that we are not under the Mosaic covenant. The commands, even in the 10 Commandments, which you're having a class on this soon, but the commands of the 10 Commandments, they're not authoritative for us because they're part of the 10 Commandments. Because we are not under the law or any of the prescriptions of the law per se. That covenant has passed away. I believe the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant. And that covenant is, what does Paul say in Galatians? We're not under that covenant. And yet, Paul does appropriate some of the commands of that covenant as authoritative for Christians. Even though we're not under that covenant, everything in the Bible is the Word of God, right? It is still the Word of God. How do we appropriate it in the new covenant situation? I would argue, so we're skipping ahead a little bit, I would argue that what is authoritative for Paul now is the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is what is authoritative for believers, not the law of Moses. The law of Christ is summarized in the command, love your neighbor as yourself. That summarizes the law of Christ. Christ exemplifies the law of Christ, right? He says, a new command I give you, love one another. See, it's a new command. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. That is not less than the law of Moses. That's more, right? Love one another as I have loved you. By this, everyone will know you're my disciples. And he says in John 15, verse 12, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus exemplified the law of Christ in that he gave his life for the sake of others. So the law of Christ is the law of love. What is the law of love? Fundamentally, It's sacrificing ourselves for the sake of others. What that means in each of our lives is different, but it is so much more than just keeping the commandments, right? You can keep the commandment not to commit adultery and treat your spouse horribly, right? You can be faithful to your marriage vows in that sense, but be cruel to your wife or your husband, and critical, and negative, and cynical, and speak unkindly to them. So the law of Christ, and I'm not saying none of this is in the Old Testament, but the law of Christ is much more than just don't commit adultery, right? So it's the law of love. What is the most loving thing to do? Sometimes it's very hard to know what the most loving thing to do is, right? It's not always simple. I've been an elder in a church for, in the last 24 years. When we have met as elders sometimes trying to decide what's the most loving and righteous thing to do. Sometimes the loving thing to do is to cast someone out of the church, right? To discipline them. So love shows up in different ways. So we're not under the law of Moses. We're under the law of Christ. That law of Christ is the law of love. Do any of the Old Testament commandments belong to the law of Christ? Yes. How do we know that? Because they're cited in the New Testament. Like what commandments? Well, don't worship other gods, right? Idolatry is wrong. Honoring your parents? Yeah, that's wrong, isn't it? Stealing, murder, adultery, lying, coveting, they're all repeated in the New Testament. Why are they authoritative? Why are they authoritative? Because they're part of the law of Christ, not because they're part of the law of Moses. What if we want to think more deeply theologically about this? Why are certain commands in the Old Testament part of the law of Christ? And I think it's right. So we're very close. I'm very close to the covenantal position. They are ultimately authoritative because they're moral norms. They're moral norms. So I agree with Don Carson, who is basically a progressive covenantalist, that the moral norms are clear a posteriori instead of a priori. That means we don't use moral, ceremonial, and civil as the basis of deciding the differences, but at the end of the day, we see, yes, those that are moral norms are part of the law of Christ. And that is important to see. Moral norms are transcendent norms. Why? I'm thinking theologically here too, right? Why are certain things moral norms? Because they represent the character of God. That's why they're moral norms. They represent God's character. So, the ceremonial moral distinction, yeah, there's truth in that, right? When it says don't wear two kinds of cloth, which is right next to love your neighbor as yourself, I think we sense that's not a transcendent moral norm. I don't know if the shirt is polyester and cotton, but if it is, I don't think I'm sinning, right? That was a command. That was part of the covenant given to Israel. But loving your neighbor as yourself, even though it's part of the Mosaic covenant, that word is authoritative, not because it's part of the Mosaic covenant. We're not under that covenant anymore. But that word is authoritative because it represents the character of God. How we finally recognize that because of the New Testament. That's why we say law of Christ. Christ embodies the moral norms of the law, and so are we too. So I want to say something else. Paul says something similar in Romans 13, right? Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. By the way, I don't understand that word. I don't know if this relates to Ethiopia, but some people say you can't have any mortgage to buy a house from that verse. I think that's not what that's saying. I don't think that verse is saying you can never owe money to anyone. Some people read it that way. I think that's an overly literal way of reading that verse. But anyway, our debt is to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Love always thinks, what's to the benefit of my neighbor? Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So it's a little more expanded. So the command, so love, love is like a rushing river, right? A beautiful rushing river. I'm sure you have those in Ethiopia. You know, we have many in the United States. Beautiful rushing river. So, the commands are like the banks of the river. They keep that river rushing well, right? And they guard us from sentimentality and deceit. So someone can't say, you know, I'm walking in love, but I'm lying. I'm walking in love, but I'm committing adultery. There are people who say, you know, I'm in love with another woman. I know I'm married to my wife, but I'm so much in love. This is what God definitely wants me to do, follow my heart of love. But we can say, no, that's not love, right? That's lust. That's not love, because you're violating the command. So the commands guard us from sentimentality and false views of love, right? Here's what love looks like. Love looks like faithfulness in marriage. Love doesn't murder another person. Love doesn't steal from another person. Love doesn't lie to another person. So the moral norms check us, but most of life is lived in that stream, you know, every day of how do I treat the people at the airport today? If you know, we had some tense situations getting out here, and you know, just to be very conscious, do we treat other people with love? You know, even if it's a tense situation, and so most of life isn't lived right. You know, you're not thinking today, presumably you're not tempted to murder anyone today, but you're still called to love one another and keep that stream going. So love never transgresses those commands. Love never goes beyond those commands, but love is much more than those commands, isn't it? And is this like a duty? Oh, we have to love one another. No, it's the gospel, right? Christ has loved you. What does Paul say? Love is the heart and soul of his ethic. Walk in love just as Christ loved us. We want to love other people because we remember the gospel. Christ loved me and gave himself for me. Because of that, I want to give myself to others, and I want to love them. So, I think that's enough. You know, we could talk about this all day. But do you want to say anything at this point about that issue, the commands and law? Oh, one other thing I want to say. So where does the difference between the progressive covenantalists and covenantalists show up practically? And we love each other. It shows up in the Sabbath. I'm not a Sabbatarian. I think the Sabbath, I didn't say this. I mentioned it earlier, though. I think the Sabbath is a shadow of the things to come. I don't think Sunday is the Sabbath. I think it's the Lord's Day. So typical covenantalists say the Sabbath is a moral norm, that on Sunday we're observing the Sabbath. I think Christians are called upon to be faithful to gather with other believers, Hebrews 10, on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. But I don't think Sunday is the Sabbath. So that's kind of where it shows up. But we're already told by Paul, if you have differences of opinion on the Sabbath, love one another, right? Accept one another on that issue. Don't get into vain arguments with one another and divide from one another over the Sabbath. Okay. So, do you want to say anything now? Any questions, comments, reflections, refutations? Yeah, that's a great question. And really that pertains to the Sabbath itself, right? That's where there's a division. I think, though, the New Testament gives us indications, right? Acts 10 and 11. And here's actually where the new perspective comes in handy, although it was long before the new perspective. Acts 10 and 11, what is Peter told? The food laws no longer apply. You know, the sheet comes down, eat all these unclean foods, and Peter goes, no way. And he says, God declares these foods clean. So circumcision's not required, right? So food laws aren't required. Circumcision, I'd say Sabbath. So we see in 1 Corinthians, we talked about this briefly, right? The commands to put to death those who are homosexuals and adulterers and kidnappers, those aren't literally applied. So I think we're giving examples in the New Testament of the kinds of things that we call ceremonial. And I don't think it's so hard in most cases to say, yeah, that's in the same category. That is like circumcision. That is like the food laws. So, but another way of saying it, laws that relate to the temple and purity and the priesthood, right? The priesthood is, Jesus is our priest. The sacrifices, Jesus is our final sacrifice. So, circumcision, what does the New Testament say? It's the spiritual circumcision of the heart. Food laws, Paul applies it in 1 Corinthians 5, don't let the leaven of malice and wickedness be in your hearts. The temple, now you are God's temple. And you know, a lot of the laws relate to the temple, paying the temple tax, the tithe. Tithing is tied to the temple, right? And the priesthood. So I think, are Christians required to tithe today? No. They're required to give generously and gladly and sacrificially. But tithing is tied to the temple and the priesthood. Well, those are gone. So I think we have these categories that help us. In most cases, it's not hard. But there are some, Sabbath is hard. Here's a command. I think we'd all agree is a moral norm, but it's not repeated in the New Testament. But why isn't it repeated in the New Testament? I think it's because it's obvious. Here's one. Don't have sex with an animal. Right? Is that a moral norm? Well, clearly, right? I don't think, if somebody were to become controversial about that, our church, this would never happen, right? Well, we would exercise church discipline. We'd say that's very clear, right? That's clearly a moral norm. So there are a few cases, tithing's probably another one, Sabbath, where there's debate, but most of them there's clarity. So, yeah, well, that's excellent, and that's exactly, if you drill down on the Sabbath debate, this is exactly what happens. Those who are Sabbatarians say, look, it's a creation ordinance. It goes back to creation. And then, yes, that you're exactly right. In 2:16, it's Sabbaton, plural. So they'll say, well, that's not talking about the Sabbath day. I would respond to that by saying, but it includes the Sabbath, and probably has the Sabbath especially in mind, since they practice it every week. The creation argument is a very good argument. I would suggest that he draws an analogy between creation and the Sabbath, but it isn't. In the New Testament, the Sabbath is never grounded in creation, and actually, in Genesis 1 and 2, it doesn't say that it's the Sabbath, but God rested on the seventh day. So that's a very specific argument. It doesn't say Sabbath, it said God rested on the seventh day. It doesn't say one needs to observe the Sabbath. But of course, in the Ten Commandments, they refer back to the creation. So a very good argument can be made for the Sabbath. I would argue ultimately those commands that are rooted in creation are repeated in the New Testament, such as I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, for Adam was formed first, and then Eve, homosexuality. You can eat all foods. But really good arguments can be made for continuing in Sabbath observance today, which is one reason I think Christians agree to disagree. Yeah.